Hi, I'm Dr. Wordperson, and I thought I would start a new series for one of my Latin teacher friends where I explain some of the weird stuff about Latin grammar from a linguistic perspective. So, even if you do not know Latin and care nothing about Latin, but you do like linguistics, you should still find plenty of stuff here to entertain you. So, Latin deponent verbs. What are they? Well, they're a class of verbs that always takes passive endings, even though they don't have meanings like anything we would think of as the passive voice. Some deponent verbs are actually things you might know from English. Like, for example, sequor, follow, like in non sequitur, it doesn't follow. There's also loquor, speak, which gives us locutus of Borg! But yeah, locutus, there doesn't really seem anything particularly passive about follow or talk. That's why this whole passive but not passive thing strikes a lot of people learning Latin as kind of weird and arbitrary and confusing. But since I'm a linguist, I'm not going to just sit here and say, well, that's Latin for you. We're going to get to the bottom of this. Linguistic detective hat on! Okay, I don't actually have any Sherlock Holmes hats, so yeah. Anyway, since deponent verbs seem to involve some kind of mix-up between the active and passive voice, let's start out by considering the linguistic concept of voice. What does voice do? Well, succinct explanation, voice basically mediates between the arguments a verb takes and the grammar and semantics of how they actually show up in a sentence. What do I mean by arguments? Well, consider a verb like headbutt. Headbutt takes two arguments, an agent and a patient. To illustrate, this is headbutting, and tracer is the agent, the headbutter, and reaper is the patient, the headbuttee. Now, let's make some sentences. In the active voice, we'd have tracer headbutted reaper. The agent is the subject, and the patient is the direct object. In the passive voice, we'd have reaper was headbutted by tracer. Basically, the patient is promoted to the subject of the sentence, and the agent becomes what's called an adjunct. It's like an argument of the verb, but now it's optional instead of obligatory. You can just say, reaper was headbutted, with no tracer mentioned at all. Now, English has an active and passive voice, but guess what? Other languages have all sorts of different voices. For example, there's one called the antipassive, where instead of demoting the subject, you demote the object and end up with an intransitive verb. There's one called the applicative, where you take an adjunct and promote it to an object. And, more to the point of Latin, there's another voice called the middle. The middle voice doesn't change the way the arguments get mapped to the syntax, it just adds the extra semantic detail that the subject was in some way the object or beneficiary of the action. If we were going to do this in the middle voice, it would mean something like tracer headbutted reaper for her own self-interest or for her own benefit. If you wanted to say reaper got angry, you'd probably use the middle because the subject, reaper, is also affected by the action, getting angry. He's so angry! Now, once upon a time, specifically around 4000 BCE on the steppes of Eurasia, there was no Latin. Instead, there was a language that was the ancestor of Latin, which we call Proto-Indo-European. And from what we can reconstruct, Proto-Indo-European only had a morphological distinction between the active and what we call the medio-passive. This medio-passive is exactly what it sounds like, one single set of verb endings to express both the middle and the passive voice. So, if you needed a passive construction, you'd use medio-passive endings. But if you needed to express that the subject was acting on itself, or that the action was somehow internal to the subject, you'd also use the medio-passive because it's also a middle voice, right? So, for some examples taken from Hittite, one of the older Indo-European languages, the active irhaitsi means sets an end to, while the middle irhaita means comes to an end, and the active nai means leads, while the middle neari means leads oneself. There is also a class of verbs that only ever inflected in the middle. And while specific verbs might drift in and out of this class, the class as an entity survived in various daughter languages. These middle-only verbs tended to be what are called unaccusative verbs. verbs whose subject is not really a semantic agent and is maybe more of a semantic object. You know, things like perception, experiencing emotion, position in motion, emitting light and sound. You know, verbs whose inherent semantics actually mesh really well with the whole subject as experiencer thing from the middle voice. Like with loquor, speak, you experience the act of speaking. With morior, die, well, you might be the subject of that verb, but you're probably not the agent. And that's where Latin deponent verbs came from. So you can see they're not some sort of bizarre new development in Latin. Deponent verbs actually straightforwardly continue the middle voice of Latin's ancestor, Proto-Indo-European. And it's pretty common for languages worldwide to have some kind of middle voice. The only reason the whole thing seems weird to us is because English doesn't have anything comparable. But this is one of the reasons it's always really cool to study foreign languages, or linguistics in general, to get a broader idea of how languages work and what the possibilities are. Alright, that was the show. Thanks for watching. Please be sure to like and subscribe, and you can support me on Patreon like these fine people. Seriously, patrons, thank you so much for supporting the show. Yeah, and if you're a Latin teacher or want any weird Latin grammar stuff explained, leave a comment down below. Hi, I'm Dr. Word Person, and I thought I would turn on the lights